TMM, an atheist YouTuber, recently made this video debunking a video by Impact Video Ministries, which is an apologetics channel, and that video was going over the 3 best arguments for God. I also made a similar video on this, but I'm going to be reacting to the reaction, and hopefully I can add some other points.
Here are 3 really bad arguments for God.
Argument number 1, the creation argument. This argument is also known as the cosmological argument. And while I could go through the argument in detail, where I go through each premise, I think it's better to explain it in a way that you can use it in a conversation. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's fine. All you need to know is that I'm going to break down this argument simply because you don't really need to know the premises unless you're in an actual debate. So the creation argument essentially states that everything that begins to exist must have a reason for its existence.
And what's the justification for that premise? William Lane Craig loves to use this argument, and his explanation of this premise is that we don't see things just pop into existence uncaused. However, something popping into existence implies that there was a time when it didn't exist, followed by a time when it does exist. The universe is the space-time continuum, so by definition, the universe exists whenever time exists. Since this is the case, the universe could not have popped into existence because there was never a time when it wasn't already in existence. This is true even if time doesn't stretch backward infinitely.
So the failed premise in that section of it is saying that the universe could not have popped into existence. And where that goes wrong is that if the universe could not have popped into existence, then that goes against all the scientific evidence we have of the Big Bang and the universe having a beginning. Because the universe had a beginning, that means something must have started the universe. Just because we don't know exactly how time works, because it was a timeless space, that not space actually, because space also didn't exist. There is no time before time. That's accurate. But there must be some timeless being who created time as well. So just saying that, oh well, time didn't exist before the universe, therefore nothing created the universe, that doesn't logically follow.
So since that's the case, we as people should also have a reason for our existence.
We're made out of chemicals. Chemistry is the reason for our existence.
This is just simply not. So saying that is just simply false, because there's many other causes for our existence. You trace the causes back to our parents, back to their parents, back to their parents. I assume the guy reacting to this believes in evolution. You go back to all the other species eventually of that first celled life. That must also have a cause. It's not just chemistry. Chemistry can't explain how the universe started. Chemistry can't explain a lot of things. A lot of things are outside of chemistry. Saying chemistry is the reason for our existence might be one of the things that allows us to exist, but chemistry could also be an effect of God creating the universe.
The way it works, everything that we see has a cause for its existence. For example, we can look at a building and we can safely assume that there were architects and construction workers that were responsible for making it. On top of that, paintings come from artists, dishes come from chefs, and forests come from seeds, and mountains come from the Earth's tectonic plates moving. So the idea is that all that we see needed to have some kind of cause, and our universe isn't any different. According to science, our universe is expanding, and if it's continuously expanding, then if we were to rewind time, there had to have been a point in which everything started.
Oh, I guess he's going to talk, but I was just going to add a point there that that is a singularity, a point of infinite density, and it was literally no matter. So this singularity technically didn't exist because it was infinitely dense, so I guess it technically did exist, but it had no matter because it had no matter. So I guess he's going to respond to this now.
Everything includes time itself, then God also had a beginning.
Sorry, right off the bat there, there has by logic. By this argument, there has to be one uncaused caused, one unmoved mover. Something caused something caused something caused something. By mathematical inferring, you can see something had to be the first cause. Something has to be infinite. If you say that nothing is infinite and you have a chain of causes stretching back to infinity, that might sound reasonable, but an infinity chain of actual things isn't reasonable because there's a better way to express it, of days. So yesterday is a cause of the day before, and you stretch it back to the beginning of time. Well, then today would never have got here. So our universe would never have got here if there was an infinite number of chains stretching back into the past and causes.
Say that something had a beginning is to say that it hasn't existed for infinite time. If it is the case that time itself had a beginning, then everything had a beginning. That would also have to be the case for God. Even God could not have existed for an infinite amount of time if there hasn't been an infinite amount of time.
So he has contradicted himself here. First, he says that there was no time before the universe, which is true, and then he says that God could not have existed for an infinite amount of time. But he is assuming that time exists before the universe, which he just said didn't happen. So in one argument, he uses time can't exist before the universe to make his point, and then in the other argument, he assumes that time does happen before the universe. And the first one is true. So saying that God could not have existed for an infinite amount of time is false. God is outside of time. So saying that he's existed for an infinite amount of time actually isn't accurate because we're fitting him into that category. But that's just the only way we can try to understand it. He's actually outside of time, not infinitely in time.
If it is true that everything which begins to exist has a cause, then God, since he began to exist, would also need a cause.
So he's making that point of God cannot exist for an infinite amount of time, which he's putting our elements of everything needs to have a cause onto that, which doesn't work because there needs to be one uncaused cause. Even the Greeks knew this. They had this what do you call it, theology? They had this philosophy, and saying that God began to exist is his point, and then so God needs a cause. That even if that was true, then you just trace the problem back one more step, or however many steps, and then you get to one uncaused cause. So just saying that like a lower being created our universe is sure, but he's not even making that point. He's just trying to refute the argument of one big God, and then just pushes it back one more cause step.
So the question is, how did everything begin? And the answer to this question is still a mystery in science because we obviously can't go back and observe how life actually began.
Given the fact that all life is made out of chemicals, it's a pretty safe bet that life began as some form of chemical activity.
So I made a video going more in depth on, I think this is probably going to be one of the next arguments, but this is the teleological argument that I think he might be starting now. It is that life is so complexly designed that it must have a designer. And so he's saying that chemicals, if you mix the chemicals of life in a test tube, you get life. And that's not true. There was a test done to like see how you recreated life, but he just took the actual cell, put the cell in, except for the part that's made with the chemical, then put the chemical in, and then he's got life. That's like saying you take an engine from one car, put it in another car, and then say you invented cars. That's not how it works. So saying that all life began as some form of chemical activity, we celebrate when we move like half of an inch in the Grand Canyon of getting from non-life to life. You cannot get this information that is 100,000 times more complex than War and Peace by mixing some chemicals in a test tube. It just can't happen. Do it millions of times. Do it trillions of times. It will not happen.
So the creation argument pretty much states that because things exist, things like the universe and its galaxies, stars, and planets, and the earth with its land, seas, and people, then something or someone had to be responsible for its existence.
If the mere existence of a thing means that it had to have a cause, then God, if he exists, had to have a cause too.
So this is, I guess this is still a cosmological argument, saying that all these things, because they exist, need to have a cause. That's not what he's arguing, I believe, unless I missed something, but he's saying that they began to exist. All these things began to exist. So the way that the guy reacting to this inferred it was everything that exists has a cause. That's not the argument of the cosmological argument. It's that everything that begins to exist. And so in one thing he says that, as I said earlier, that time doesn't exist outside the universe, then assumes that, then says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. So he has these three different points that all contradict each other.
And while people may argue and say, well, maybe the universe was just always here, to that, I'd say that the universe expanding is proof that our universe isn't infinite.
No, it isn't proof, but even if it were, and time had a beginning, that would mean that God had a beginning too. Also, even if time hasn't existed infinitely, it has still always existed in the sense that there was obviously never a time when time didn't exist.
So I'm going to address the beginning of it first. So he says, no, it isn't proof. There are a bunch of other proofs, so even if this wasn't, it would be, but it is proof because by mathematical inferring, you get to a singularity at some point. And so that means time had a beginning, yes. So he says that would mean God had a beginning too. He's not provided evidence for that. He asserted earlier that God needs a beginning too because God began to exist. and that's just not true. So what he's using circular reasoning here, and sorry, not circular reasoning. He's using contradicting reasoning that proves his other reasoning false. And so he says that even if time hasn't existed infinitely, which is true, like even like atheists agree with that, and he says it has still always existed in the sense that when there was obviously never a time when time didn't exist. So he, I'm not. So where he's having this flaw here is that saying there was a time when time didn't exist. Yes, if always existed means only inside the universe, then we can only ever consider things inside our universe. But if always means outside of our universe as well, because the universe had a beginning. So we need to consider all things as always, not just things inside of our universe.
Always existed in the sense that there was obviously never a time when time didn't exist.
Because it all had to start at a single point in history.
Since the universe is the space-time continuum, the universe by definition would begin when time began.
And that is true.
Notice that you didn't draw the point of the beginning of the universe at the beginning of the timeline. This seems to imply that time preceded the universe's beginning, which by definition it did not.
So, but yes, this is true, but well, most of that is true. He said he put history at the beginning of the timeline. That's because we can't really understand how time worked before the universe, as I said, but everything that begins to exist has a cause, and God caused the universe. So just because we work by having this space-time continuum doesn't mean that God necessarily does too. God created space. God created time. Therefore, he is timeless and immaterial. If he creates space and time, he must be outside of space and time, which means that we can't fully understand how time works for God.
Because from what we know and observe from the universe, that's the most logical conclusion we can come to. So if the universe and everything in it seems to have needed a cause or reason to exist, then God or some higher power seems to be the only explanation that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense, though. You can't cause something to exist at a time when it already exists, and by definition, there was never a time when the space-time continuum did not exist.
Okay.
2x NASA.
There are so many flaws in this. So actually, just one big flaw that he assumes everything else. He says that there was never a time when the space-time continuum did not exist. And this is true if you define time, but he's using time in two different senses. In one argument before, he said he uses time as only space-time continuum, and the other argument he says that God must require a beginning, implying there's time outside of the universe. He's using time in two different ways, which is, I forget what it's called, but that's definitely a fallacy of some kind. And by definition, there was never a time when the space-time continuum did not exist. And that is true. Doesn't mean doesn't need a cause, though. He's putting those two things as if they're the same thing, which just isn't true.
Did not exist.
And I know some people will say, you Christians look at the unknown and turn off your minds and credit the unknown to God. At least scientists are out there observing and trying to figure everything out. You know, back when I was in college, I sat in one of my friend's classes, and JP Moreland was the professor, and he taught his class something interesting. And he stated that the origin of the universe is outside the realm of science.
If that were the case, then you couldn't cite science as evidence that the universe even had an origin.
So, this is false. So, saying that you can't cite scientific evidence as evidence that the universe had an origin, while at first glance that might seem true, it's actually not true, because you can see the evidence of a designer from a design. You see that something must have caused these. You're using science and logic together. If you just have the definition of science as empirical observation, then yes, but science also includes logic. Scientists also need to be philosophers. They need to interpret the evidence. Science itself doesn't say anything. Scientists do.
And the reason why is because science is based on the scientific method, or in other words, it relies solely on us making observations of the world around us. So due to the fact that time, space, and matter all began at a single point in time, a point in time that no one can go back and observe, science then cannot answer the question of how the universe began. So Moreland, the professor, then asserted that the question of how the universe began should actually be answered in the realm of philosophy, not science.
This is so true. Oh wait, okay. He is a long blurb of text here.
Again, if science can show that the universe began without directly observing that beginning, why couldn't it show how it began? This is all
because we cannot observe how the universe began, but with empirical observation. You can't use a test. You can't drop something to observe. You can drop something to observe gravity. You can't go back in time and see how the universe began directly with empirical observation.
Also a common creationist straw man of science. Science does not need to directly observe an event in order to apply the scientific method to studying it. If that were the case, there could be no such thing as forensic science or paleontology.
So he contradicts himself in this argument here. In one part, he says that the science can be used to see how the universe why the universe had a beginning, also how it began and what caused the universe to have a beginning. But he also said that time doesn't exist before the universe, so you can't see, and that cause would be outside the universe. So you can observe how the universe began only once time already exists, and you can't go back before time, as he said in previous arguments.
Science can study an event that nobody observed by studying the consequences of that event. That's how we know that there even was a Big Bang.
And I thought that was interesting. For me personally, if someone were to tell me, "You're just turning off your mind and crediting the unknown to God," I'd respond, "I'm not turning off my mind. I just think that a higher power that is greater than time, space, and matter can only be responsible for creating the universe that we observe today."
That's a conclusion that I could only believe if I don't think about it for longer than 2 seconds.
Wow, okay, that was aggressive.
What would it even mean for a being to be higher than time, space, or matter?
Yeah, the way he phrased that was slightly weird. He meant by being higher as in immaterial, outside of time, outside of space, outside of matter, not contained within them, but can exist outside of them.
Time and space are the
And
prerequisites
you logically need to have one of those things.
of existence itself.
Okay, time and space are the prerequisites of existence itself. By that logic, you need to have an infinite chain of beings going on and on back to not the beginning of the universe, because there was no beginning. You need to have it go on infinitely, which is logically impossible, as I said earlier. Saying that time and space are prerequisites of existence itself is only true for material objects. If you define material objects that began to exist as material objects that began to exist, that's a tautology. It's a circular argument that doesn't prove anything.
To say that something exists is to say that it has location in space-time. To say that something exists...
So if it has a location in space-time, so that would mean that your thoughts don't exist. That would mean that your ideas don't exist. That would mean that your desires don't exist. That's just not true. Things exist without physically existing.
Without space-time is to say that it exists nowhere and never.
So saying that something exists without space-time is saying it exists nowhere and never. That is just an assertion. He's not providing any evidence for that. But logically, something must exist outside the universe in order for the universe to start. So he's saying that nothing created everything out of nothing, which is not logical.
In other words, it means the same as saying that it does not exist.
Do you have a better explanation on why everything exists today?
Yeah, it has never not existed, therefore its existence does not need a cause and could not have a cause.
So he is saying that the universe is infinite, which is refuted by modern science. So this guy, he hasn't directly claimed it. I think he's trying to frame it as, I'm scientific, this guy's not. But then he claims that the universe is infinite, which is both logically impossible and scientifically impossible.
Because if you do, then I'd love to listen and I'm willing to learn. So if you're watching this and you're someone who does not believe in God, I'd challenge you and ask, how do you think we all came to exist?
We came to exist from chemicals, and those...
So we came to exist from chemicals again. I answered that earlier. I don't need to respond to that again.
Those chemicals came from fundamental energy that has never not existed and therefore does not need a cause.
So he doesn't really define fundamental energy here, but just saying chemicals come from energy, and energy has never not existed. So he basically, it all leads back to, he's saying the universe is infinite. And by saying that there's nothing else outside the universe, that means that only this universe is infinite. He's not even appealing to like Big Bangs or multiverse. So basically, he's saying he's denying science and the Big Bang proving that the universe had a beginning.
Because I think there needs to be some explanation on why we all exist, and I think that God creating everything seems the most likely and logical. And if you're a Christian and you're wondering how to use this argument in a conversation, you can simply ask people, where do you think we all came from? And how do you think the universe began? Because it did not just pop into existence. Something or someone needed to have caused it.
I agree that it didn't pop into existence because...
No, you don't. You just had like 2 arguments in a row claiming that the universe is infinite if you look at it logically, and then saying that it doesn't pop into existence.
Because that implies that there was a time when it wasn't already in existence. There was never a time when the universe did not exist, and that's true even if time has not been infinite.
So he's defining time in 2 different ways here again. So saying there was never a time that the universe didn't exist, That's true even if time has not been infinite. Well, that's not true even if time has not been infinite. Time that we can understand only exists within our space-time continuum. That does not mean that nothing outside the universe existed. He's equating time not existing outside the universe, which is true by definition, with nothing existing outside the universe, which is not true by definition. He's saying he's just assuming that. So he's saying those as if they're the same thing.
There was never a time when the universe did not exist, and that's true even if time has not been infinite.
And if they argue and say, well, how do we know that? Things can just pop into existence, and that might be
That's what he just said, so let's see how the answers to this.
the case for the universe. To that, I'd probably say that we don't observe things popping in and out of existence freely in our day-to-day lives. So if that's the case, there needs to be a cause for the existence of our universe.
The fact that we never see things begin without cause in no way means that everything needs a cause.
He just said like 5 arguments ago that everything needs a cause. And then in this argument, he says that everything does not need a cause.
I've never seen your mom pop a wheelie on a motorcycle. That doesn't mean it can't happen.
So he's saying that never seeing something doesn't mean that can't happen. And that's true. But then he claims that he just flat out denies the law of causality, which is the fundamental principle of science.
And should people ask, well, who created God then? To help with that question, you can watch our video titled, Who Created God?
How much you want to
Okay, he's just being rude here.
bet that they make a special pleading argument?
When my team pitched the idea.
Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to look at part 2 up here.
How much you want to bet that they
And subscribe.